As the world watches the escalating tensions between Israel and Iran, with missiles lighting up the skies over Tehran and Tel Aviv on June 13th and 14th of 2025, it is impossible to ignore the undercurrent of a much older, more insidious conflict. Beyond the immediate reports of military targets and casualties lies a narrative actively promoted by certain Western and Israeli leaders, the dream of regime change in Iran. This isn't just about neutralizing a perceived threat, it's about fundamentally reshaping the nation's political landscape. The goal, whispered in diplomatic corridors and declared more boldly by hawkish pundits, is to replace the current government with one more compliant to Western interests, a leadership that would align itself with Washington and Tel Aviv, effectively undoing the 1979 revolution. This ambition is not a new development. It is the continuation of a long-standing foreign policy playbook that has viewed Iran not as a sovereign nation, but as a strategic chessboard. The recent military escalations, which saw Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu boast of paving a path to Tehran, are presented as a security necessity. Yet, when he directly addresses the Iranian people, urging them to rise up and promising that the strikes will pave the way for their freedom, the true objective becomes transparent. This language deliberately frames a military assault as a liberation mission, a dangerous and historically fraught justification for external interference in the domestic affairs of another country, ignoring the complexities and desires of the Iranian people themselves. The strategy involves more than just military pressure. It is a multifaceted campaign that includes crippling economic sanctions, covert operations, and a relentless information war designed to destabilize the country from within and without. The ultimate prize is the installation of a friendly government, one that would abandon its regional alliances and its independent foreign policy. This hidden agenda seeks to turn back the clock to an era when Iran's vast resources and strategic location were firmly under Western influence. For many Iranians, however, this vision is not one of liberation, but of a return to a dark and painful chapter in their nation's history, a time when their destiny was decided not in Tehran, but in London and Washington. Understanding this context is crucial to deciphering the current crisis. The headlines focus on drone capabilities and nuclear enrichment sites, but the real story is about power, control, and historical grievances. The push for regime change, championed by figures who have long advocated for a more aggressive posture towards Iran, is a gamble that risks plunging the entire region into a devastating and uncontrollable war. It is a plan that conveniently overlooks the lessons of the past and dismisses the will of 88 million people who, despite their diverse political views, share a deep-seated suspicion of foreign powers promising salvation through intervention. The echoes of history are deafening, and we must listen closely to avoid repeating its gravest mistakes. To comprehend the deep-rooted Iranian skepticism toward Western intentions, one must travel back to 1953. This was the year that Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a coup d'état. Mossadegh was a nationalist hero to many, celebrated for his bold move to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had been under the control of the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company for decades. This act of economic self-determination was seen as an unacceptable defiance by Western powers, who viewed Iran's resources as their rightful prize. In response, the American CIA and British MI6 orchestrated Operation Ajax, a covert plot to depose Mossadegh and restore the full monarchical power of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah. The success of the 1953 coup marked a tragic turning point. It extinguished Iran's brief but vibrant experiment with democracy and installed a ruler who would owe his throne to foreign intelligence agencies. For the next quarter-century, the Shah ruled Iran as a loyal and crucial ally of the United States and Israel in the Middle East. His government opened the country's oil wealth to Western corporations and became a major buyer of American military hardware. In return, Washington and Tel Aviv provided the Shah with unwavering political, military, and intelligence support, turning a blind eye to the increasingly autocratic nature of his rule and the systematic suppression of all forms of political dissent within the country. This era is often romanticized in the West as a time of glamour, modernization, and secular progress, with images of Western fashion and lavish parties in Tehran. However, for the majority of Iranians, it was a period defined by vast inequality and a lack of fundamental freedoms. The Shah's modernization projects often benefited a small, wealthy elite connected to the royal court, while millions of ordinary citizens were left behind. The immense oil revenues failed to translate into widespread prosperity, and corruption was rampant throughout the government. This growing discontent festered beneath the surface, creating a combustible environment that would eventually lead to a revolutionary explosion. The Shah's reign was not a golden age of freedom. It was an autocracy propped up by foreign powers for their own strategic benefit. This historical betrayal is seared into Iran's national memory. It is the original sin from which decades of mistrust have grown. When Iranians today hear Western leaders speak of bringing democracy or freedom to their country, they remember the last time such promises were made. They remember that the West's intervention did not bring liberty, but instead dismantled their democracy and imposed a dictator who served foreign interests above those of his own people, a historical wound that has never fully healed. The glamorous facade of the Shah's Iran concealed a brutal and terrifying reality, enforced by his notorious secret police, SAVAK. Formed in 1957 with direct assistance from the American CIA and later Israel's Mossad, SAVAK became a symbol of the regime's tyranny. Its official purpose was to safeguard the state, but its true function was to crush any and all opposition to the Shah's absolute rule. Its agents were everywhere, creating a pervasive atmosphere of fear that silenced intellectuals, students, artists, labor activists, and religious leaders. The slightest hint of dissent could lead to an arrest in the middle of the night, followed by interrogation, imprisonment, and often brutal torture. Life under the watchful eye of SAVAK was suffocating. There was no freedom of speech, no freedom of the press, and no freedom of assembly. Political parties were banned, and labor unions were controlled by the state. University campuses were heavily monitored, and professors and students who dared to question the regime's policies faced expulsion, arrest, or worse. The methods employed by SAVAK were infamous for their cruelty, with human rights organizations documenting systematic torture techniques that included electric shocks, beatings, and psychological abuse. Thousands of political prisoners filled the Shah's jails, suffering in horrific conditions for the crime of imagining a different future for their country. This relentless repression was the price of the Shah's alliance with the West. While American presidents praised him as a wise and benevolent leader, his regime was torturing its own citizens with skills taught by American and Israeli intelligence experts. The iron fist of SAVAK ensured that the monarchy remained stable and that Iran's oil continued to flow westward without interruption. This stark contradiction was not lost on the Iranian people. They saw the Shah not as a modernizing visionary, but as a puppet whose power was maintained by foreign patrons who were indifferent to their suffering as long as their geopolitical interests were secured. The brutality of SAVAK was a primary catalyst for the 1979 Islamic Revolution. It united Iranians from all walks of life, secular nationalists, socialists, and Islamists, in a common struggle against a hated dictatorship. The revolution was not just about economic grievances or religious fervor, it was a profound popular uprising for dignity, independence, and the right to self-determination. The memory of SAVAK's terror serves as a powerful reminder of what life was like under a foreign-backed autocrat. It is why promises of a return to that era, championed by the Shah's own son, are met with such deep-seated revulsion by so many inside Iran. When proponents of regime change talk about liberating Iran, they often, paint a misleading picture that really ignores the country's progress since the 1979 revolution, especially when you compare it to the era of the Shah. One of the clearest ways to see this change is through literacy. Under the Shah's rule, despite all his talk of modernization, the national literacy rate was a dismal 40%. The monarchy's policies, honestly, created a society with deep educational inequality, particularly for women and people living in rural areas. Fast forward to today, And despite decades of tough sanctions and international isolation, Iran's literacy rate has soared to nearly 90%. In fact, female university students now outnumber their male counterparts, a remarkable achievement by any standard. The political landscape has also changed, though in complex and sometimes contradictory ways. The Shah's Iran was an absolute monarchy, with no elections or public participation at all. The whole system was set up to concentrate power in the hands of a single man. In contrast, the Islamic Republic, often called a controlled democracy, does hold regular elections for both its presidency and parliament. Sure, the Guardian Council vets candidates, but the process still allows for a degree of political competition and public debate that would have been unimaginable under the Pahlavi dynasty. Millions of Iranians take part in these elections, seeing them as a meaningful, if imperfect, way to influence their country's direction. There's also been a fundamental shift in the idea of rights and national sovereignty. Under the Shah, Iran's foreign and economic policies were, for the most part, subservient to the interests of the United States. Today, Iran follows a fiercely independent foreign policy, a source of national pride for many citizens, even those who are critical of the government's domestic policies. The difference is also clear in how minorities are treated. For example, Iranian Jewish organizations, including the Tehran Jewish Committee, have publicly condemned recent Israeli strikes and have asserted their identity as Iranians first and foremost. This kind of public dissent against a foreign power would have been unthinkable under the Shah. Now, that's not to say that modern Iran doesn't have serious challenges. The government faces real criticism over human rights, social freedoms, and economic management. There's significant public discontent, and the struggle for a more open and just society is ongoing. But comparing today's complex reality to a romanticized and inaccurate version of the Shah's era is a big historical mistake. It ignores real progress in education and political participation and dismisses the hard-won independence that Iranians achieved through revolution. Real change has to recognize this progress, not try to erase it by turning back the clock. In the middle of the current conflict, a familiar figure has re-emerged on the global stage: Reza Pahlavi, the son of the deposed Shah. After living in exile for over 4 decades, Pahlavi presents himself as a democratic alternative to the current Iranian government. But honestly, his path to power seems to depend less on popular support from inside Iran, and more on the backing of the same foreign powers that supported his father's dictatorship. He's been seen publicly alongside Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, a move that has really alienated many Iranians, who see it as a betrayal of their national sovereignty and an endorsement of military aggression against their homeland. Pahlavi's platform, frankly, seems designed to please his foreign sponsors. He's promised that, if he were to come to power, he'd re-establish the so-called historic ties between Iran and Israel. And he's even stated publicly that not a single penny would be spent on supporting the Palestinian cause. That's a direct reversal of a core part of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy. These promises, you could say, are music to the ears of hawks in Tel Aviv and Washington who dream of a compliant Iran acting as a regional partner. However, for many Iranians, these pledges just confirm their worst fears: that Pahlavi isn't a patriot looking to liberate his country, but rather an aspiring puppet ruler, willing to trade away Iran's independence for a throne. His campaign is also haunted by the brutal legacy of his father's regime. While he talks about freedom and human rights, he's been criticized for not clearly condemning the widespread atrocities committed by his father's SAVAK secret police. This kind of historical amnesia is really troubling to generations of Iranians who suffered under that oppression. On top of that, the actions of some of his most ardent supporters in the diaspora, who have been documented attacking pro-Palestine demonstrators, raise serious questions about the tolerant and democratic future he claims to represent. This gap between his rhetoric and the reality of his political project hasn't gone unnoticed by people inside Iran. The push to install Reza Pahlavi is a textbook example of foreign powers trying to handpick a leader for another nation. It's a strategy based on the flawed assumption that Iranians are longing for the return of a monarchy that was overthrown by a massive popular revolution. Sure, a small segment of the diaspora might support him, but there's little evidence of widespread enthusiasm for his cause within Iran itself. Iranians have a long and bitter history with foreign-imposed rulers. They know all too well that leaders who come to power on the back of foreign tanks or covert deals rarely serve the interests of their own people, a lesson learned through blood and tears. The world doesn't really need to guess what happens when powerful nations try to impose new leaders on other countries. The recent past gives us a grim and devastating catalogue of failure. Just look at Afghanistan, where the United States installed Hamid Karzai after the 2001 invasion. His government was plagued by corruption and never seen as legitimate by a large part of the population, ultimately collapsing the moment foreign military support was withdrawn. Take Iraq, where Ahmed Chalabi, a favorite of Washington neoconservatives, helped provide the false intelligence that justified an invasion. That led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands and the rise of ISIS. These hand-picked leaders didn't bring stability or democracy. Instead, they presided over chaos, civil war, and immense human suffering. The pattern is, unfortunately, tragically consistent. In Libya, Western intervention to overthrow Muammar Gaddafi in 2011 was sold as a humanitarian mission to protect civilians. Instead, it shattered the country, creating a failed state run by rival militias and turning it into a hub for human trafficking and terrorism. In Syria, years of foreign-backed efforts to topple the government have resulted in a catastrophic proxy war that's destroyed the nation and displaced millions. And in Yemen, a Saudi-led, Western-backed war has created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. In every case, the promise of a quick and clean liberation led by a compliant new leader turned out to be a mirage, hiding a nightmare of endless violence and destruction. This history is exactly why so many Iranians, even those deeply critical of their own government, are adamant that change must come from within. They understand that national sovereignty isn't just a theoretical idea, it's the crucial shield that protects a nation from being torn apart by outside forces. The demand for real change, for more social freedoms, economic justice, and more accountable governance is powerful and legitimate. But this struggle belongs to the Iranian people. They believe their future should be decided through internal political processes, activism and debate, not by foreign bombs or by a leader chosen in a foreign capital. As the drums of war beat louder, it's really important that we remember these lessons. The path of foreign intervention and imposed regime change is a path to ruin. It's a strategy that disrespects the history, dignity and agency of the Iranian people. True support for them doesn't mean endorsing military strikes or backing a monarchist restoration. It means listening to the voices of ordinary Iranians, understanding their complex realities, and respecting their right to determine their own destiny on their own terms. To ignore this is to condemn yet another generation in the Middle East to a cycle of violence and despair, repeating the same tragic mistakes we should have learned from long ago.